You know how the start of school breaks are always so glorious? You speedrun through all of the things you wish you could have done during the school year, and sometimes you will find new hobbies, and if your family could afford it, you go to class or even camp. But eventually, at the end of summer, after you've gone through all of that, you actually get kind of bored. So that's what happened to Tom Sawyer. Summer break has come and he had joined and quit clubs. He went to see the circus, which, by the way, started a borderline suicidal hobby for a while. And then he fell sick. It took a while, but when he finally got better, the new trend in town for the kids was church. So when he found Joe Harper, his best friend, Joe just recited a bunch of Bible verses at him, so Tom was like, nah. What made it worse was that the trial for the murder of Dr. Robinson had begun, and Tom couldn't avoid it. It was all everyone talked about. Tom and Huckleberry Finn even met up and basically renewed their vows to never tell anybody what they saw that night of the murder. But even then, they felt bad because Muff Potter was actually nice to kids. Muff Potter would fix Tom's kite sometimes, and there was a time when Muff Potter shared his fish with Huckleberry, even though Muff Potter didn't have enough for two people. But the only thing that they could do for Muff Potter was to visit his jail and sneak some tobacco and matches to him. Luckily, the jail that he was assigned to was on the first floor and there was a window. Muff Potter was super grateful to the kids. He said them visiting him was a real comfort, but he did say that he did an awful thing, and why he did that, which was he thought he murdered Dr. Robinson, he doesn't even know why, except that probably he was drunk again that night, and in a fit of craziness, he went ahead and murdered him somehow. But anyway, Muff Potter said he did a wrong thing and he should hang for it, and that was the right thing to do. The next few days, the trial began. Tom and Huckleberry decided that the both of them shouldn't be seen in public together because maybe people would put two and two together somehow and find them involved in the murder. Never mind that they were known to play together. Anyway, after the second day of trial, they overheard that Joe the murderer had already testified and that his story was so compelling that there was really no question anymore about what the verdict of the jury might be. The next day, court was in session. The prosecution's first witness was the person who found Potter washing himself in a brook in the morning after the murder. Muff Potter's lawyer had no questions to ask this witness. The second witness of the day was the person who found the knife near the corpse. And again, Muff Potter's defense lawyer had no questions to ask the witness. The third witness brought by the prosecution was the person who testified that he often saw Potter in possession of the same knife that was found at the crime scene. Potter's lawyer, again, declined to question the third witness as well. More and more witnesses came, and Potter's defense declined to question all of them. They were basically doing nothing. At this point, the village had already formed their opinion about Muff Potter, which was that he murdered Dr. Robinson, but nevertheless, they were still annoyed that the defense wasn't really doing anything. Finally, the prosecution said, "By the oaths of the citizens whose words are above suspicion, we fasten this awful crime beyond all possibility of question to this prisoner. We rest our case." At this point, Potter had already put his face in his hands. He looked so devoid of hope that everyone could see it. He started rocking his body like a child, just trying to self-comfort. Some people in the audience even started to feel sorry for Potter, and some even started to tear up. It really did look like what Potter said, that he got drunk, he went crazy, and then he killed Dr. Robinson. Now, it was the defense's turn to speak. The defense lawyer said, "Your Honor, in our remarks at the opening of the trial, We said our purpose was to prove that our client performed this awful deed only because he was under the influence of alcohol, which led to delirium. Then the lawyer said, "We have changed our mind. We shall not offer that plea." Which means the lawyer is now saying, scratch everything, Muff Potter didn't do anything wrong, my client is innocent. And then the lawyer said, call Thomas Sawyer. All eyes were on Tom as he marched to the stand. Then the questioning started. The defense lawyer asked, "Thomas Sawyer, where were you on the night of 17th of June about the hour of midnight?" Tom made the mistake of making eye contact with Joe the murderer because now suddenly he couldn't speak. He tried to make a sound, but his body just wouldn't. But finally, he was able to choke out, "In the graveyard, sir." And then it started flowing. Tom told everyone in court about what happened that night, minus the mention of Huckleberry Finn, because what happened was this was Tom's deal with the lawyer that he would tell everything, but he would leave his friend out of it because Huckleberry Finn didn't want to be part of this. And just before Tom got to the part where Joe the murderer plunges the knife into Dr. Robinson's chest, there was a loud crash. And when everyone looked, there was a Joe the murderer shaped hole in the window because Joe had just jumped through it and escaped. So Muff Potter was released and Tom was a hero in town. He basked in that glory, but at night his dreams were infested with Joe the murderer coming to get his revenge on him. And Huckleberry Finn was scared too. His name wasn't even mentioned in court, but he was just scared that Joe the murderer might figure out that he was there too. It was a while before the boys felt like themselves again, and Tom eventually had the hankering to just dig for treasures like boys did back in the day. He wanted to take Joe Harper with him, but on that particular day, Joe Harper was off fishing, so Tom got Huckleberry to come instead. So the two boys went to dig for treasure. Did they have a treasure map? No. So the plan was to just pick out a suspicious looking tree, and start digging around it. The boys were at it for a while. They even started fantasizing about what they would do if they find treasure, even though they have been just digging random trees in town. Tom said he would buy things like a new drum, a sword, and also he would get married. Huckleberry Finn didn't like that. He was like, "Married couples fight. Why would you do it? And I wouldn't be able to see you again." But Tom was like, "No, I know which girl I'm gonna marry, and we never fight." Which, sir, we know that you're thinking about Becky, all right? And you guys do nothing but fight. Anyway, Tom also promised Huckleberry that if he did get married, he would give Huckleberry his own room in the house so that they could still hang out. So sweet. Meanwhile, for Huckleberry, if he got treasure, then he planned to spend it all on soda and pie every day, and also he would spend it as fastly as he could because he said if his dad got into it, if his dad got his hands on the money, he would just spend it all, like gamble it all away. So Huckleberry Finn would much prefer to just spend the money right away. So the boys dug and dug and dug, but no treasure. They even decided that maybe they should dig at midnight so that the shadows of the tree branches would guide them on where to dig. There must be some sort of system that these treasure barriers follow. But they tried that. They went at midnight, but that was too creepy. Not that they were cowards, In fact, they were going to the haunted house next time and find treasure there. Everybody knows that robbers would only hide stuff in haunted places because the ghost would help you guard your treasure. So the boys eventually did go to the haunted house. They dug up a tree outside first, but there was nothing, so they decided to go inside and loot the house. Once inside, they dropped their tools on the ground inside the house, inside the main room of the house. The house was so old that the ground wasn't even a floor. There was no tiles or planks or anything. It was just dirt. And the boys found everything so spooky that they were just creeping around at first around that house, but eventually they realized that there was nothing in there. And also it was noon, so it wasn't really that creepy at all. And eventually they dared each other to go up to the second floor to explore. The stairs, when they were going up, they found that those were rotting already because it was so old. So that basically was part of the dare. Do you dare go up this rotten set of stairs? So the boys went upstairs, but they didn't really find anything. So as they were about to go back downstairs, they heard some noise from the first floor. The boys flattened themselves on the floor. The floor on the second story were just planks, so there were gaps in the middle where they could see and hear everything. It was the Spaniard and his companion. So the Spaniard is a character in town. People have been seeing this guy walking around town with his companion, but they always call the Spaniard because he had a big cape around him all the time and green glasses. He was also known to be deaf and mute, so it wasn't like he was interacting with anybody in town, but everybody knew him. And there was the companion. They didn't know the name, they didn't have a nickname for it, but just a known companion of the Spaniard. The Spaniard's companion was talking. He was saying about some job that they have to do, which was too dangerous. And to the boys' astonishment, the Spaniard started talking. And worse than that, the boys recognized that voice. They could recognize that voice anywhere because it has been haunting them in their dreams. It was none other than Joe the murderer. So basically, the Spaniard was Joe the murderer in disguise so that people in town wouldn't know that it was Joe the murderer. So Joe the murderer responded, and he was saying how this job is very important to him because he needs to get his revenge. And after that is done, then he and the companion can then both escape to Texas together. Then Joe the murderer said he needed to take a nap. He asked the companion to be a lookout, and Joe the murderer fell asleep right there on the ground on the first floor. And before long, the companion also fell asleep. Meanwhile, the boys were still stuck upstairs and they didn't move. They couldn't move. Actually, Tom tried to move once. He got up to see if he can sneak down and out of the house, but as soon as he took the first step, the floorboards creaked so bad and so loudly that Tom thought that his soul was going to leave his body right there. So he melted back to the floor beside Huckleberry, and they stayed that way until the sun was setting. So remember, these boys reached the haunted house about noon, and the sun was already setting at this point, and it was summer. Anyway, Joe the murderer woke up first eventually, and he shook the companion awake. The two men decided to go off and do stuff in the cover of the night, as they do. But before they left, they started talking about whether they should leave their stash because it was too heavy, and then they would just come back for it before they run away to Texas together. Tom and Huckleberry were wide awake, still upstairs, and they heard everything. They were silently asking what did he say? Stash? Apparently, Joe the murderer was carrying $600 with him. That's an amount that these boys have never seen in their lives in one place. And the companion was suggesting that they bury that money into the ground right there inside the haunted house, like literally just below where Tom and Huckleberry were. The companion said he just saw some tools over there. Those were Tom and Huckleberry's tools right there that the companion saw. So these two men started digging the ground using Tom and Huckleberry's tools, and meanwhile, the boys were upstairs, not shaking in fear this time. They were full of gloat and greed as they watched these two idiots hide treasure right in front of them. Suddenly, the shovel went thunk. Joe the murderer had hit something on the ground. He went and dug it up, and it was a box. And then he opened the box, and it was $2,000 worth of gold. The men were stunned, and the two boys above them were silently having seizures. To these boys, thousands of money was a mythical thing. Thousands? What does thousands even mean? They didn't even know that money could reach that high of a number. So the men, after they have recovered from shock themselves, they talked about how a gang passed the town last year, and they thought that maybe the gang left that treasure there and hadn't had the chance to come back for it. They talked about burying all the stash back into the hole that they dug, which, by the way, the boys above were like foaming at the mouth, like, yes. But Joe the murderer suddenly stopped and said, wait, no. These shovels that we are using, I remember when we picked them up, they had fresh dirt on them. So it means that someone was here. Someone just left them. If we bury this treasure in the same spot, then the person who left the tools might come back, see the disturbed dirt, and start digging, and they would get our treasure. So no, we have to put this somewhere else. Let's put it in number 2 under the cross. So that was like a code to a secret place that Joe the murderer was referring to, number 2 under the cross. The boys above were like, no, but they started peeing themselves because Joe the murderer suddenly turned to the stairs and said, you know what? Maybe the person who left the shovels is still here. The boys were trapped. There was nowhere else to go besides jumping through the second-story window. And as Joe the murderer stepped on the stairs, it broke because it was so old, it was rotting. So Joe the murderer just left with the stash, and the boys stayed upstairs while they gathered their souls back into their bodies and kicked themselves for missing the treasure. The next day, after confirming that all of it was not a dream, Tom and Huckleberry decided that they were going to go after the treasure. Never mind that this is Joe the murderer that they're dealing with, and never mind that Joe the murderer was just talking about a revenge that he was planning to do, and he has plenty of revenge to get from Tom. They had a clue, which was number 2 under the cross. Number 2 must mean a room, and Tom found an inn called Temperance Tavern that not only had a number 2 room that was forever rented out, but that room's door was also conveniently facing the alleyway, so the person renting it was never really seen. So that room seemed like the one that they were looking for. The boys actually snuck into the room. It wasn't even a question. They waited for a moonless night, and they stole keys from Aunt Polly, like the bunch of keys that she had. One of the random keys from that bunch worked. It opened the door. But as Tom went in, Joe the murderer was right there on the floor, sleeping. Tom almost fully stepped on Joe. Luckily, Joe was drunk. He didn't even wake up. So the boys canceled that plan. One thing that you need to know for context, by the way, is that inn's name. The inn's name is called Temperance Tavern. So inns back in the day doubled as a bar and also a place to sleep, like hotels. It is advertised to support temperance. Temperance meant abstinence from alcohol at that time. There was a whole movement during that time period to encourage people to not to drink alcohol because people were drinking way too much around then. So seeing Joe the murderer drunk inside Temperance Tavern technically meant the boys also knew about one more crime being committed by the owners of this inn. That's gonna come up later, just remember that. So the boys had to make a new plan. They couldn't just go in and loot number 2 because Joe the murderer, the person who is known to, murder, was there. So the plan now was that Huckleberry Finn would stake out the place all day, every day. Huckleberry Finn didn't mind because he usually slept on the streets anyway, and as soon as he sees Joe the murderer leave the room, he would run back to Tom's house and meow outside of his window so that both of them could come together to number 2 and take the treasure. One night passed and no news from Huckleberry Finn. But Tom was soon distracted from the $2,000 worth of gold coins because Becky had come back into town. She was off on a little holiday with her parents, and now they were back. And also, she was following through on that picnic that she invited everyone to. So the Thatchers were a little fancy. This picnic that they organize is not just a gathering of kids in a park inside town. First of all, there was no chaperone. Becky invited a bunch of older kids anyway. They were like 18, so that was good enough. Also, the venue of the picnic is a ferry boat's ride away from the town. It was technically walkable. I mean, if you wanted to walk for hours, you could, but it was much easier to hire a ferry boat and just shuttle the kids to a port that was nearby the picnic spot. So this place was far. It was so far that Becky's mom actually asked Becky to not come home for the night because the pier where the ferry would be docked in town was far away from the house, and Mrs. Thatcher, Becky's mom, she didn't want Becky to be walking home alone that late at night. So Becky said, okay, she was just going to stay at Susie Harper's place instead. Susie Harper, by the way, is Joe Harper's sister. So everybody went, all the kids, and during the picnic, Tom pulled Becky aside and said, hey, before you tell Susie Harper that you're staying with her, I have a better idea. Let's go to Widow Douglas's place instead for the night. She is known by everyone in town to love children. She always has ice cream for us, and I bet she would love for us to just hang out with her for the night. And Becky was tempted. She was like, ice cream, you say? Maybe. Anyway, at the picnic, everyone ate, and after recovering from their food coma, the kids decided to explore the cave nearby. So the cave is a popular tourist attraction. It was huge and cut deep into the mountain. It was not the type of cave that was just one cavern. It had so many passages and crevices, little caverns, big caverns. But the front part of the cave was very well explored, so a lot of the kids were familiar with parts of it actually. So the kids were prepared actually. They knew they were going to explore this cave, so they grabbed the bundles of candles that they brought and put them in their pockets. The kids went in as one big group, and since there were so many passageways, they naturally broke up into smaller and smaller groups. Sometimes a group would be walking for a while and suddenly bump into another group like out of nowhere. And sometimes a group would be walking half an hour without even seeing anyone else. That was how confusing the passageways were. But that's okay because the kids knew to use candle smoke to mark the walls so they would know how to get back. In fact, the walls were filled with graffiti because people wrote on the cave walls all the time. Eventually, the kids climbed back out of the cave, all dirty from the clay in the cave and the candle smoke that they used to write on the walls. They realized that it was much later than they thought. The guy who was driving the ferry boat had been clanging his bell for them for over half an hour even, so everyone rushed to pack up and get on the boat. And then the ferry boat sailed back towards town. Huckleberry Finn, meanwhile, who was, by the way, was not invited, poor Huck, actually saw that ferry boat pass by in the distance. He was still guarding room number 2. It was already dark, and suddenly the door opened to room number 2. Huckleberry squeezed himself out of sight just in time as Joe the murderer and his companion walked by. Huckleberry spotted a box under Joe the murderer's arm. That must be the treasure. There was no time to go back to Tom's place to call him. Joe the murderer and the companion were already walking away with the treasure. Also, Tom didn't tell Huckleberry, but Tom wasn't even home. So Huckleberry made the executive decision to follow Joe the murderer himself. They walked for a long time. They were now outside of town. Huckleberry Finn had been very careful to walk a distance away from Joe the murderer, and he didn't bring any light with him because that would be very telling, no? It's dark. He was just following the light of Joe the murderer's lantern, so he was totally unseen. Suddenly, there was no light and no sound coming out of Joe the murderer or at a distance. Huckleberry couldn't see anything. So Huckleberry thought that he had lost Joe the murderer, so he started walking faster and he almost bumped into Joe the murderer and the companion. So what happened was Joe the murderer had turned out the light and stopped walking because he was now at his destination. Huckleberry, after recovering from shock from almost bumping into Joe the murderer, looked up and he realized they were outside of Widow Douglas's place. Remember Widow Douglas? Huckleberry was close enough to Joe and the companion that he could hear what they were saying. The companion was telling Joe to just let it go. They were so rich now. They had all those gold. They could just go to Texas right now. But Joe wouldn't let it go. He was talking about revenge. He said Widow Douglas's dead husband whipped him right in front of the whole town, and that's something he would never forget. He has to get his revenge before he leaves town for good. And since that man had the audacity to die before Joe could get revenge, Joe would just get his revenge on the man's wife, which was Widow Douglas. Joe the murderer planned to mutilate her, like slit her nostrils and ears and tie her to the bed. And if she bleeds out and die, then that's her fault. The companion was horrified. So was Huckleberry, but the companion decided to go along with the plan still. The problem for Joe the murderer was the light was on inside the widow's house. That meant she had company. So the men decided to wait for a bit to see if the visitors would leave before carrying out the attack. Meanwhile, Huckleberry Finn decided that this would be the best time for him to get help. He liked Widow Douglas. She was one of the few people in town who was nice to him. So, quietly, Huckleberry Finn ran down to the nearest house that he recognized and banged on the door. This house was lived by a family called the Welshmans. At first, they didn't want to open the door because what does this ratty, dirty boy want? But then they realized how late it was, and the banging did sound very urgent, so they went ahead and let Huckleberry in. Huckleberry explained everything. Well, almost everything. He told them about how there were two men, he didn't say who, but there were two men who were about to attack Widow Douglas. He also begged the Welshmans to not tell anybody that he was involved because he was just so scared that the two men may come after him. So there was Papa Welshman, the dad, and he had two sons. All three men grabbed their guns and started to sneak up to Widow Douglas's place, and Huckleberry was there too to point where the two men were. Huckleberry stayed behind as the men went on into the darkness. So Huckleberry was still there. He was still on the road, but he just stayed back a little bit after pointing the men towards where the two attackers were. The men didn't bring any light so that they could surprise the attackers. Huckleberry hid behind a boulder. There was a long, anxious silence. And suddenly, there were rapid explosions like fireworks. And with that, Huckleberry decided that he would not stay for the plot. He ran away as fast as he could. But at the crack of dawn, Huckleberry went back to the Welshman's place to ask what happened. And this time, the Welshmans welcomed him back. They gave Huckleberry some breakfast, and while they were eating, the Welshmans told Huckleberry how Papa Welshman accidentally sneezed while sneaking up on the attackers, so they didn't have a choice but to open fire right away. The attackers fired back, but they basically ran away. It was very hard to aim because it was so dark and they weren't in the right position to be able to apprehend the attackers, But the attackers did drop a box that they had with them, and inside it was tools for robbery. So in Huckleberry's mind, he was like, damn, the treasure's probably still in number 2 then. He should probably get back there soon. But Papa Welshman asked Huckleberry how exactly he found out about the attackers. This was a long way out of town from where Huckleberry was known to hang out, so how did he know? And what could Huckleberry say? He couldn't tell the truth about following Joe the murderer for treasure, so he had to do a little bit of improv. Huckleberry offered that the attackers were actually the Spaniard and the companion. At least sprinkle a little bit of truth in there, you know? Huckleberry said he saw the men walking through town and he got curious, so he followed them. And basically, he overheard them saying that they were going to attack the widow. But Papa Welshman at this point was like, wait, the Spaniard's deaf and mute though. And that was the end of Huck's improv skills. So he was like, fine. The Spaniard is basically Joe the murderer. And so now it's an even bigger deal than it was because this is a person at large, Joe the murderer. The sheriff was coming soon to get a statement, basically, and the Welshman's promised to protect Huckleberry by keeping his name completely out of it. Huckleberry was just too scared, so all morning he was just begging the Welshmans again to please let him stay out of it. So the Welshman said, okay, while he's there, because the sheriff's coming, just take a nap back there in the house. Just keep hidden. You probably didn't get to sleep last night anyway. We'll call you as soon as it's safe, like after the sheriff is away and all of the nosy people from town is gone. So Huckleberry went right ahead for a nap inside the Welshman's house. Meanwhile, this was morning and it was also a Sunday morning, so that meant church. Mrs. Thatcher, Becky's mom, she came into church and went up to the Harpers. She saw Joe and Susie Harper there, but no Becky. So Mrs. Thatcher went up to Mrs. Harper and said, "Oh, is my Becky still sleeping? I'm so sorry for the trouble. She might have been so tired after the picnic yesterday, but thanks for letting her stay at your place." And Mrs. Harper just blinked at Mrs. Thatcher. She was like, "Becky who?" And Becky's mom was like, "My Becky, Becky Thatcher. Did she stay at your place last night?" Mrs. Harper said no. And Becky's mom sat down in a daze. You know the initial stage of dread, of devastation when you're just in denial for a little bit? That was it. Right at the same time, Aunt Polly came into church and she went up to Mrs. Harper. So she was like, "Oh, Mrs. Harper, is Tom still sleeping in? I'm so sorry for the trouble. Thanks for letting him stay at your place with Joe." And once again, Mrs. Harper was like, "What are you talking about? Tom didn't sleep at our place. Why does everyone think that your kids are staying at my place?" So Aunt Polly, she turned to Joe Harper and she asked him when he has last seen Tom Sawyer. But Joe Harper couldn't remember. And all through service, nobody in church was paying attention because whispers were being passed around asking any kid when they had last seen Tom and Becky. But nobody could remember. Nobody could even say for sure if they were on the boat back to town last night. They left in such a hurry and everyone was tired. And eventually, someone said the thing that everyone was afraid of saying, which is that Tom and Becky might still be in the cave. So that was part 3 of the adventures of Tom Sawyer. See you in part 4.